Would you welcome a very exciting young lady, Anne Margret. She is...
It was January 22nd, 1975.
Well, that's the longest introduction I've ever given anybody on this show.
I know, thank you very much.
A crisp winter night across America, and right around 11:30 p.m., living rooms across the country lit up with the familiar intro to The Tonight Show. But what viewers saw that night wasn't the usual polished Hollywood segment. It was Anne Margret, brayless, radiant, fierce, owning the stage in a way that felt completely unrehearsed, because it was. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't planned. It was pure instinct, the Swedish soul behind the scandal. But to understand what really happened on that January night in 1975, you have to rewind, not to a Hollywood backlot or a rehearsal room, but to a tiny village just miles from the Arctic Circle. Valsjöbyn, Sweden. The population is approximately 150 people. That's it. No red carpets, no agents, just snow-draped forests, wooden homes, and the kind of silence you can hear. And that's where little Anne Margret Olsen first learned how to move, not just her body, but the world around her. In Valsjöbyn, life was about function, not flash. People didn't posture. They endured. They celebrated simplicity. And most importantly, they believed the human body was just that, a body. Not something to be dressed up for controversy, not something to be shamed. Just a part of nature, like the frozen lakes and mountain winds. No performance, no pretense. Anne Margret's mother, Anna, was a seamstress. Her father, Gustav, worked with an electrical company but left for America shortly after her birth. So her early years were shaped almost entirely by her mother, and that quiet, durable Swedish resilience. There was no hustle. No, you gotta be a star, kid. Just steady care and quiet faith. But everything changed when she turned 7. That was when she and her mother boarded a ship across the Atlantic to reunite with Gustav in Illinois. And while the move to America opened a new world, it never really erased the old one. That Swedish stillness stayed in her bones, no matter how loud the music got later. In the suburbs of Chicago, something clicked. She enrolled at the Marjorie Young School of Dance, and it was clear almost instantly she wasn't just good. She was electric. Even as a child, her movement had this natural rhythm to it, like she wasn't learning choreography. She was remembering it. She once said, "I was born in rhythm." That wasn't ego. That was muscle memory from a soul shaped in silence. But here's what's easy to miss if you're only watching the glittery Hollywood reel. The confidence you saw in that braless moment on The Tonight Show wasn't rebellion. It was comfort. Deep cultural comfort. Because in Sweden, there was never a need to hide the body or turn it into a spectacle. There was no taboo, no double meaning, just authenticity. Swedes tend to hold their emotions close to the chest. They're not big on drama. They're big on presence, on modesty, on letting actions speak. So when Anne Margret took the stage without a bra in 1975, she wasn't making a point. She wasn't trying to shock anyone. She was just doing what felt natural to her. That might sound simple, but in the culture of 1970s America, that simplicity hit like a thunderclap. Because, remember, this was a time when television still blurred out cleavage in prime time, when women were either buttoned up or burned at the stake, metaphorically speaking, for stepping outside the script. And here was this woman, foreign-born, sensuous, confident, dancing and singing in a flowing, body-hugging outfit, completely unbothered by what others might say. And that's what made it so disarming. It didn't feel like a protest. It didn't feel like branding. It felt like the truth. She wasn't selling sex. She wasn't selling feminism. She was showing what happens when you grow up in a culture that doesn't teach you to fear your reflection. And that's what American audiences weren't used to, because over here, the female body was a battlefield. You had to either armor it or weaponize it, but she didn't do either. She just let it exist. And the irony is that neutrality, her refusal to posture, was what made it so iconic. That choice, or rather that non-choice, flipped a switch for thousands watching at home. They weren't used to seeing a woman perform like that without some kind of agenda stamped on it. But cultural upbringing sticks, even when you cross oceans. And Anne Margret never lost that Swedish softness. In interviews, she's gentle, gracious, even shy. She's spoken often about being more comfortable performing than talking. She preferred movement to explanation. And that's Valsjöbin in her bones. You see, upbringing doesn't just teach us how to behave. It teaches us what feels normal. And for her, expressing herself without shame wasn't brave. It wasn't radical. It was muscle memory, a quiet inheritance from a snowy village most of the world has never heard of. That's why she didn't wear a bra on national television, not to defy norms or chase headlines, but because she never grew up thinking that needed explaining. But it would take a perfect storm of celebrity, culture wars, and one very specific night in 1975 for that quiet authenticity to be interpreted as something radical. Because in America, in the middle of the 1970s, just being real could accidentally make you revolutionary. The night that changed everything. It's January 22nd, 1975, and The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, is, without exaggeration, the beating heart of late-night television. It's not just a talk show. It's where American pop culture gets stamped, approved, and broadcast to millions. If you made it to Johnny's couch, you weren't just in showbiz, you were showbiz. That night, something unusual was already brewing behind the curtain. Anne Margret wasn't just there to chat. She was there to perform live, something rare for The Tonight Show at the time, and she was promoting her upcoming CBS television special titled Anne Margret Olsen, and she'd chosen a song that wasn't a classic or a crowd pleaser. It was something raw and powerful. Kiki D's I've Got the Music in Me. This wasn't your typical late-night croon with a big band and soft lighting. It was charged. From the moment the opening beat hit, Anne Margret didn't just walk onto that stage, she exploded onto it. Now, let's talk about the outfit, because it's what rewired the room. She walked out in a flowing top that was loose, elegant, and unmistakably braless. But this wasn't wardrobe shock for the sake of scandal. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't vulgar. It moved with her, and as she danced, you could see it. The fabric swaying, her body completely uninhibited. Not in a sexualized way, on a freeway. That kind of freedom, especially on network television in the mid-70s, wasn't just rare. It was unheard of. Keep in mind, this was an era when even the Mary Tyler Moore Show got letters if a female character wore pants too often. The visual of a woman, especially one as famously glamorous as Anne Margret, owning that stage, no bra, no hesitation, and zero apologies, that was more than a performance. It was a collision. The moment her voice hit the chorus, "Ain't got no trouble in my life," you could almost feel it ripple through the crowd. Her vocals were gritty, emotional, and full-throated. But it was her movement that locked people in. She wasn't dancing to the music. She was the music. Kicks, spins, sudden drops, all with that signature fiery red mane whipping around her shoulders. It was physical storytelling in real time. And Johnny Carson? Silent. Not out of disapproval, just stunned. He's sitting there, eyes wide, almost slack-jawed, because, like the audience, he wasn't watching a variety act anymore. He was witnessing something that didn't fit the usual box. Then came the eruption. When she hit her final note and struck that last pose, the room didn't just clap, it roared. Standing ovation, whistles, cheers, and on camera, You can actually see Johnny sort of gathering himself, like he wasn't prepared for what just happened in his own studio. But while the audience was lighting up with energy, not everyone in the building was thrilled. Behind the scenes, the network suits were already scrambling. Phones started ringing. Execs were leaning over switchboards. Some wanted the footage cut for reruns. Others argued the performance needed to be edited before rebroadcast. They were worried. The no-bra choice, the freedom of the outfit, the boldness of the movement, none of it had been explicitly cleared. And even though nothing technically broke any rules, they knew what they were seeing wasn't just entertainment. It was something bigger, and they weren't sure how to handle it. But the public? They loved it. The morning after, newspapers across the country mentioned the performance. Radio DJs described it with words like wild, unfiltered, and electric. Fans sent in letters mostly positive. Some conservative watchdog groups predictably clutched their pearls. But even they had trouble pinning down exactly what rule had been broken. That was the magic of it. It danced just outside the lines of what was acceptable, while never actually crossing any. And this is where the cultural significance really starts to unfold. Because this wasn't the kind of TV moment engineered by PR teams or late-night producers. It wasn't the result of some marketing gimmick or accidental wardrobe malfunction. This was pure instinct. One woman showed up exactly as she was, shaped by a childhood where modesty didn't mean covering up. It meant not making a fuss. That Swedish ease with the body had met American television's obsession with propriety, and in the clash, something timeless had been created. Anne Margret didn't wear a bra on national TV, and that decision, whether conscious or not, became a touchpoint not just for fashion or femininity, but for what it meant to own your presence on a stage built by men. She wasn't waiting to be introduced. She wasn't being asked to twirl politely. She showed up, took up space, and commanded it. And maybe that's what made the moment stick. Not just the wardrobe, not just the vocals, but the control. So much of the 70s conversation around women was still framed by whether they were being allowed to do things. Allowed to work, allowed to lead, allowed to be sexual. But Anne Margret didn't ask permission. She just was. And America saw it. Millions saw it. She performed "I've Got the Music in Me" again during her CBS special shortly after. But that wasn't live, and the impact wasn't the same. The magic had been in the surprise, the risk, and the moment of full creative surrender that can't really be rehearsed. Even now, you can find grainy clips of the original Tonight Show performance floating around online. The quality is low, but the electricity is still there. Her voice cuts through. Her presence dominates. And the camera never quite knows where to land, because Anne Margret keeps owning the frame in this spontaneous, volcanic way that just doesn't age. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Because when you grow up in a village where the body is accepted without judgment, and you bring that philosophy into a culture obsessed with appearances, something's bound to crack. Not in a destructive way, in a way that reveals a gap between what people expect and what's possible when someone chooses not to perform, but simply exists. That night wasn't just about a song or a dress. It was a moment where authenticity collided with spectacle, and authenticity won. But here's what's wild. This wasn't Anne Margret's first cultural flashpoint. That raw energy, the refusal to conform quietly, was part of a much larger pattern that had been playing out long before she walked onto Johnny Carson's stage. The accidental revolutionary. While other women were burning bras as political statements, Anne Margret was quietly living her truth. The night she appeared on The Tonight Show, braless wasn't part of some orchestrated feminist protest. There were no speeches, no slogans, and definitely no press release. But it happened smack in the middle of the 1970s, right when the second wave of feminism was swelling, and in that moment, whether she intended it or not, she became part of something much bigger. Across America, The feminist movement was taking aim at everything from job inequality to reproductive rights. And fashion. Yes, fashion was a battlefield. The bra, once seen as a symbol of modern womanhood, was now being rebranded as a tool of patriarchal oppression. Protesters at the Miss America pageant in 1968 famously tossed bras into a freedom trash can. And while no bras were literally set on fire, the media ran with the phrase, bra-burning feminists. But Anne Margret? She wasn't burning anything. She was performing, fully immersed in her art, unconcerned with whether her wardrobe met anyone's expectations. While the media framed bra refusal as rebellion, to her it was just normal, a byproduct of how she was raised. Swedish culture, especially in the post-war years, carried a radically different relationship to the body. In her memoir, Anne Margret talks about her childhood in Valsjöben, a tiny village near the Norwegian border. There, modesty wasn't about covering up. It was about humility. You didn't flaunt, but you also didn't obsess over hiding. Physicality was accepted, functional. So, when she later hit Hollywood and its endless expectations, heels this high, hair that big, bras padded and wired into compliance, she never truly internalized it. She played the part, sure, but it wasn't her core. That's why the night she walked on stage braless didn't feel like a political act. To her, it was simply the most natural way to move, to breathe, and to perform. And ironically, that uncalculated choice, one that came from intuition, not ideology, is exactly why it landed like a firecracker in the American living room. Roger Ebert captured this contradiction perfectly years later. In a 1982 Cannes interview, he described spotting Anne Margret at a party, looking extravagantly braless beneath a light yellow knit. Even then, more than a decade after her Tonight Show performance, she still wasn't playing by the industry's silent wardrobe rules. But again, it didn't come off as provocative. It came off as effortless. And that's where the real disruption lived. Because here's the thing, calculated activism has its place. It's essential. It pushes systems, forces policies to change, and carves space where there was none. But sometimes, authentic living does something just as powerful, if not more so. It shows people what's possible when the performance drops. And Anne Margret wasn't trying to model freedom. She was free. That kind of presence does something to a viewer. It sticks in your brain, not as a headline, but as a feeling. You could argue that had she marched with signs or done interviews about body autonomy, she might have been dismissed, too political, too controversial. But by simply existing unapologetically, she slipped under the radar and directly into people's subconscious. For the young women watching from their couches in places like Ohio, Arkansas, or small-town Idaho, it wasn't about theory. It was, wait, you mean I don't have to wear one either? And the ripple effects were real. In the mid to late 1970s, bralessness went from taboo to trending. Designers like Halston and Diane von Furstenberg embraced slinkier silhouettes. Fashion spreads in Vogue featured plunging necklines and sheer fabrics, with no underwire in sight. The Vogue retrospective on 70s style even calls it the decade when the body became part of the outfit, not just hidden beneath it. Some of that shift came from the streets, sure, but a big part of it came from the screen. Anne Margret didn't start the no-bra movement, but she fed it without trying. Because viewers didn't just see a woman without a bra, they saw a woman without hesitation. Someone who looked like she wasn't concerned about how she'd be perceived. Someone who moved like she had nothing to prove. Her memoir makes that clear. She writes about the constant tug-of-war between the roles she was cast in, bombshell, muse, love interest, and the woman she actually was, a motorcycle rider, a stage-shaking performer, a woman who once broke several ribs in a fall during a live Vegas show, returned to the stage like it was nothing. She was soft-spoken off camera, but volcanic on it. She didn't want to be boxed in. And when producers tried to contain her or direct her toward safer roles, she simply found new ones. So, when people today rewatch that Tonight Show performance, or scroll across a grainy clip on social media late at night, it doesn't just read as cool or nostalgic. It reads as honest. It feels less like a planned moment and more like a rare glimpse into someone who hadn't been taught to apologize for existing. That's what makes it so magnetic. In an era where so many acts of self-expression are monetized, branded, and strategically rolled out for maximum clicks, there's something subversive about someone who just does what feels right. And maybe that's why Anne Margret didn't get dragged into the culture wars of her day. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't posing, she was just being. That made her unpredictable. And in Hollywood, unpredictable women are dangerous, but also unforgettable. So, what drove this woman to remain so authentically herself in an industry built on artificial personas? How did she hold on to that core of quiet defiance, even when the world demanded she polish herself into a product? The real Anne Margret, behind the image. And that's the thing about Anne Margret not wearing a bra on national TV. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It wasn't a calculated stunt. It was something quieter and weirder for the time: honesty. And when you trace that honesty back to its source, it leads you to the real Anne Margret, far from the glitz of Vegas lights or the velvet chairs of late-night talk shows. Because here's the real twist. That braless performance? It wasn't an outlier. It was the surface shimmer of a much deeper current, the psychology of a woman who learned, early on, to move through life in rhythm with herself, not with the crowd. You start to see it in her memoir. She talks about how she was raised in Sweden, specifically in Valsjöbyn, a tiny village so cold and isolated that emotional expression had to be functional. Stoicism wasn't a philosophy there, it was survival. Her family didn't do theatrics. They did strength, silence, and hard work. And when they immigrated to the United States in the late 1940s, Anne Margret brought that Swedish steadiness with her. But she also absorbed something else: the electricity of American ambition. That fusion shaped her core. When she trained as a dancer under David Winter, her body became her first language, not in a sexualized way, but in a disciplined, expressive, almost sacred way. Movement wasn't about being seen, it was about being felt. She once said in an interview that dance allowed her to feel most honest because it didn't rely on words. Her comfort in her body wasn't about flaunting it, it was about owning it. And that night on The Tonight Show, when she spun and leapt across the stage in that silk ensemble, braless and completely unself-conscious, she wasn't trying to be provocative. She was just in motion, fully in her element. But the press didn't get that. To them, it was a scandal, or a statement, or at least something that needed to be addressed. But here's what's fascinating. Anne Margret never did. She didn't apologize. She didn't defend. She didn't even comment. Not once. The closest she ever came to addressing it was in her book, where she wrote, "I always tried to be true to myself." If that made people uncomfortable, I couldn't help that. That was her code. Authenticity over optics. Always. And maybe the most grounded part of her truth was how she lived off stage. This is the woman who married Roger Smith in 1967 and stayed with him until his death nearly 5 decades later. A Vegas headliner, sex symbol, and Elvis's on-screen flame, but also a wife who stepped back from work in the 70s to take care of her husband when he fell ill. She turned down major roles. She quietly sacrificed the spotlight for family. In the middle of the storm, she built a private island of calm. No reality shows, no tell-alls, just fierce loyalty and faith. That duality, hyper-visibility and intentional privacy, is what kept her sane. And it's also what made the whole bra controversy so interesting, because the public expected it to be part of a pattern, a rebellious icon pushing boundaries. But the truth is, it wasn't rebellion at all. It was just one more expression of her refusal to filter herself. She didn't take the bra off for shock value. She simply didn't see the point of wearing it. And she never thought she needed to explain why. And that's where her psychology becomes fascinating, because most public figures, especially women in the spotlight, build personas to protect themselves. Layers of branding, layers of stylists, managers, and image consultants. Anne Margret had all of that, but underneath it, there was always this refusal to betray her gut. Her interviews over the years are consistent. When asked about fame, she often downplays it. When asked about the image, she shrugs. She's more interested in motorcycles and grandchildren than red carpets. In one interview with Charlie Rose, she said she never chased celebrity. "I just wanted to perform," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." And that clarity is rare, especially in the 1960s and 70s, when sex symbols were expected to play characters both on screen and off. But Anne Margret never let her image control her. She once said, "The image of being a sex symbol is a bit embarrassing if you believe it, but if you don't believe it, then it's okay." And that's the key. She never drank her own Kool-Aid. Even when she played alongside Elvis in Viva Las Vegas, and yes, they had a real romance, she never let the mythology swallow her. The tabloids were relentless. Fans speculated. And while Elvis couldn't walk the line between myth and reality, Anne Margret did. After their split, she never exploited it. She never sold stories. In fact, she defended his memory for years, saying she'd loved him deeply, but it was never going to work. Their lives were on different tracks. The reason she could survive all of it, the fame, the gossip, the expectations, is because she never gave up her internal compass. Her dance background gave her discipline. Her Swedish roots gave her quiet resilience. Her marriage gave her anchoring. So when she walked onto national TV in January of 1975 and danced without a bra, it wasn't a statement. It was just her. At ease, in flow, unfiltered, and honestly, that might be the most revolutionary part. Because in a culture obsessed with labeling every action, branding it, monetizing it, spinning it into content, her refusal to explain herself was quietly radical. It forced people to confront the idea that not everything women do with their bodies is political or sexual. Sometimes it's just human. Even decades later, Anne Margret kept that same energy. Whether it was performing in a biker jacket at age 71 or reflecting on her career in that AARP interview, she stayed grounded. She never played the aging sex symbol card, never courted scandal. She just kept showing up as herself, quietly reminding everyone that authenticity ages better than fame. And maybe that's why the Tonight Show moment sticks. Not because it was salacious, but because it was real. A flash of unfiltered self in a world built on performance. And when millions of viewers watched it live, they didn't just see a woman dancing without a bra. They saw someone completely at ease in her body, her career, and her choices. And that level of comfort was, and still is, disarming. Which brings us back to that short answer we promised. Why didn't Anne Margret wear a bra on national TV? Because she didn't feel like she needed to. That's it. No hidden agenda. No PR move. Just instinct. Which, in hindsight, might be the most powerful answer of all. But now, here's the bigger question, the one that doesn't get asked nearly enough. What happens when a single moment of unapologetic authenticity hits the cultural bloodstream? What kind of ripple effect does it create in an industry built on illusion? The legacy of authentic expression. And the ripple effect? It didn't stop when the Tonight Show credits rolled. That moment, Anne Margret, completely herself on national television, became something bigger than late-night entertainment. It became a reference point, a symbol, One of those rare pop culture moments that slips past the censors and lands straight in the bloodstream of culture. And it quietly rewired what authenticity could look like for women on screen. Suddenly, the rules weren't so rigid. Actresses started showing up with more edge, more freedom. Not copying her, but responding to a shift. The industry saw Anne Margret dancing braless and thought, wait, is that allowed now? Once that crack appeared, others widened it. Television in the late 70s began loosening its grip. You had Stevie Nicks, Tina Turner, and even a young Dolly Parton embracing feminine expression that didn't fit the male-approved mold. What Anne Margret did wasn't overtly political, but that's what made it hit harder. It wasn't packaged as rebellion, it just was. Sometimes, just existing outside the script is more powerful than rewriting it. She gave body positivity a blueprint before we had a name for it. No hashtags, no campaigns. Just a woman saying, "This is what my body looks like when I'm doing what I love." And that's enough. Even now, that moment feels modern. Scroll TikTok or Instagram, and you see creators going viral for being unapologetically real. No makeup, no filters, just vibes. It might feel like a Gen Z innovation, but its roots trace back to people like Anne Margret, who showed that authenticity isn't a costume. It's a choice. That choice is why she didn't fade like others. 60-plus years in the industry, no reinvention arc, no dramatic rebrand. She didn't need one. Her career lasted because it was rooted in something real. The same woman who starred in a Vegas show rode a motorcycle in her 70s and recorded a rock album in her 80s. That 2023 album, Born to Be Wild, wasn't nostalgia bait. It was her, still doing what she loves. And people noticed. At 84, she was back in headlines, not for scandal, but for showing up as herself. The Today Show called it joyful. People magazine called her timeless. But the real flex? She never stopped being Anne Margret. She didn't wear a bra on national TV. And here's why. She didn't need to. More importantly, she didn't want to. And she trusted that was reason enough. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply be yourself. And maybe that's the real reason it mattered. Anne Margret didn't wear a bra on national TV, and it wasn't for shock or rebellion. It was her saying, "This is mine," her body, her voice, her moment. And even now, it challenges us to ask, what do we censor because we're afraid?